is such a joy. I can't even express how much joy it is to be here with you this Saturday morning. Before we start, just a few words from the Psalms. I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist popping into the Psalms. Let's turn to Psalm 42. Psalm 42, the verses 1 and 2. As the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God. I thirst for the living God. When can I go and stand before him? Hallelujah. Now, to even begin to define or explain what Wesleyan spirituality is a task that I don't think anyone could possibly achieve in this lifetime. But it is worth looking at it today as we look at the world in which we are today. This is one of the most, it has become for me a consuming passion. What is Wesleyan spirituality? I remember beginning my journey as a local preacher, being introduced to the life, the works, and the sermons of John Wesley. And on this journey, I discovered that although many were moved and attracted to his words, his many words, I should say, that there was something behind the words that actually energized it. And it became, for me, how do you say it? I wanted to dig more to find out what it was that gave such power to the words. And so I began to read more about the life of John Wesley. And there I discovered this. Way back, even before his ministry took off, even before 1738, the Adelsgate experience, even before these great celebrated sermons, we see that looking back into the life of both Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley, that they had grown up in an environment of being soaked in word, in prayer, in the disciplines of what we now call the disciplines of the Christian life. Most people attribute this to the mother, Susanna Wesley, given time each day, not just to draw the children into a discovery of a life with God, but also, she extended it to the servants and to neighbors and people in their neighborhood, which really drew my attention to the fact that what we are calling Wesleyan spirituality, we often just focus on what John Wesley did and what his brother and what his contemporaries in the Wesleyan stream did. But actually it began with his childhood, with his mother. And when we look back there, we see a great respect for and a great drawing from the early church, from the work of the early fathers. And so my first point, discovering our family treasure, is really double, really. Discovering our family treasure as in going back to the formation of John Wesley, but also going back to the beginnings of the church. Methodism, as we know, began as a renewal movement in the Church of England. And one of the characteristics of renewal movement, and particularly of the Methodists, was the fact that Christian spirituality was at the center of who they were, the people who were called Methodists. It was at the center of who they were and what they did. And we find in in the writings of the people at the time, that there was such great hunger for God, such great hunger for the word, such great hunger for experiencing life in the spirit. And when we read Wesley's writings, we see these things. So he talks about the indwelling of the spirit and being awakened by, one of my favorite sermons is Awake, O thou who sleepest. And one of our charisms, to borrow a word from Martin Atkinson's Resource in Renewal, charisms, early charisms, was this sort of vibrant spirituality, sort of hunger and thirst for God, as I was reading from Psalm 42, such a drive towards coming closer to the God who had called them to faith. And we find in church history that this particular period of the Methodist, of the beginning of Methodism, was a significant shift in the 18th century evangelical revival. And I do believe that a huge part of this was this insatiable hunger for God. And what was the focus of this? What was the focus of Wesleyan spirituality? And I want to keep it simple. I don't want to use big words. It was really, if we're going to bring it to the basics, it was knowing the Lord, knowing his ways, becoming more like him. We were singing just earlier, take Lord and fashion us in your likeness. This is the core of Wesleyan spirituality. To know him, to know his ways, to become more like him, to be fashioned in his likeness, and all for his glory. This was the energy, this was the fire, really. This was the fire that brought forth what we call today Methodism. I would like to pause here for a few minutes and to ask a question. So you can type your response in the chat quite quickly. When you first became a Methodist, or when you first encountered a Methodist, what was it that caught your attention about Methodism? One word responses are great, sentences are great, in just a few moments. You can pop it quickly in the chat. Okay, kindness, yeah. Love, yeah. Love for others, yes. Hospitality, yeah, that's a great one. Welcome, yeah. Sensing the presence of God at Cliff College, wow. Donald English, yes. Gentleness, grace, and Christ-likeness, joy, yeah, yeah. One or two more? Fellowship based on word and worship. Yes. A lay person. Yes. Yes. The encouragement for lay people to, yeah. Singing. Hallelujah. Yes. Life encountered at Easter people. Wow. Look at that. Acceptance, yes. So we were picking up on some of these themes as we go on. And so as I mentioned earlier, Wesleyan spirituality had a huge focus, really great focus, and really from Wesley's sermon, especially from the sermon, Awake Thou That Sleepest, this focus on becoming aware of God, not just becoming aware of God, but a surrendering of oneself to the life of God. And with the aim really, and the focus being the vital union of our souls with God. This is a direct borrowing from the words of John Wesley, the vital union of our souls with God. And when you read, especially this sermon of Wesley, I think it's sermon 3 in the 44 sermons, Awake Thou the Sleepers, there's this all-encompassing, this sort of all-engaging call to open up to the move on the work of the Spirit within, not just awakening to the awareness of God, but awakening to the work of God and the power of God within, to be changed, to become truly and really connected to God. And this sort of connection, or shall we put it, I'll go straight back to words of Wesley, becoming a habitation of God through his Spirit. This was the focus. The indwelling of the Spirit, cultivating in the Methodist, in the Christian, I should say, not just Methodist, but in the Christian, inner and outer holiness, the love of God and neighbor. Some of you have mentioned how encountering Methodists, you found joy, acceptance, love of God and neighbor, and the fruits of the Spirit, or the cultivation of the holy tempers. This was Wesleyan spirituality. And John Wesley really didn't give any, when you read his teachings and his sermons and his instructions, especially to the leaders of the small groups, he really didn't give any slack to this. The cultivation of the holy tempers, what we would today call the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, goodness, self-control, all these. This was the focus of Wesleyan spirituality. And this is what gave energy to the preaching and the teaching of John Wesley and the early Methodists. Can you imagine all these years after John Wesley, his sermons still have power and is bringing about conversion and revival, maybe not in England, but in other parts of the world, because of this total commitment to becoming, in his words, a habitation of God through his Spirit. This was the focus of Wesleyan spirituality, the development of what we will call today the fruit of the Spirit, or the holy tempers. How did Wesley teach people to come to this point of becoming this holy habitation of God's Spirit? What were the mechanisms? We know that Wesley was a great man of discipline. And I suppose some of us would say that the means or the process is what Wesley calls the means of grace. Just now we heard in the sermon, one of Wesley's big things, a central part of Wesleyan spirituality is a deep and thoughtful contemplation, words borrowed from our preacher this morning, on the scriptures. We hear how Wesley devoted his life to devouring the scriptures. This was a central point of his spirituality. Alongside that with prayer and fasting. Today we would call it perhaps the disciplines of the spiritual life, which some say, I had a friend who said to me, well, that's a bit Catholic. And I said, well, it might be, but actually it's Christian and it's very Methodist. How much of our time today within our Methodist family are we encouraging, not just in new believers and people at the beginning of their life of disciples, but even those of us who have been on the journey a while? How much time and energy and resource are we committing to encouraging people to daily put their whole being, their whole heart into becoming a habitation of God through his Spirit? We need to begin a rediscovery of our roots, going back and digging for treasure, claiming back this family treasure of ours, because this was the energy that brought about that great work of God in the days of Wesley and his contemporaries.
We're going to go into breakout rooms now, just for a few minutes. About 5 people per room. You'll be allocated a room automatically, and just talk about what has struck you, what jumps out at you from this, what's new, what's good to be remembered, what you're going to continue to reflect on or do differently in the light of all of this. Let's just get some conversation and responses going in our breakout rooms.
What can we say about Wesleyan spirituality and preaching today? What can we say about Wesleyan spirituality in today's context? I would like us first to look at a passage from Scripture. Before I talk too much, I'll let Scripture speak. Can you all see this verse? Acts chapter 4 and verse 13. So this verse comes out of a story from Acts of the Apostles, when after 2 of Jesus's disciples had healed a man, had got themselves into trouble with the religious authorities, and they'd been called in and interrogated. And they were being asked what gave them the right, what gave them the authority, who gave them the authority to do what they were doing and say what they were saying. And they spoke. And this verse really, in these days, has really captured my attention as I've thought about the early Methodist preachers. We forget that not many of Wesley's preachers were as educated as John and Charles. Yes, they had some well-educated colleagues who knew the scriptures backwards and forwards, who knew Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and knew it all. But there were also those who were on the ground, the leaders of the small groups, who were also traveling around, men and women, who would fit exactly in these words. They had boldness and unfettered eloquence, but they were also unlearned and untrained. The power that came from them having submitted themselves to being with the Lord. This is the fruit of really the principles of Wesleyan spirituality. Is that the result of this becoming an habitation of God through His Spirit, the result of this growth of intimacy with God, is the boldness and eloquence that goes beyond having been trained or having had special educational advantages. And in today's world, where we have so many voices in and outside the church, teaching so many truths and captivating people's attention, looking even on social media, we have available to us today this power that the disciples of old had in proclaiming the word, and this power that John Wesley and the early preachers had that accompanied their preaching, that so changed their generation. This wasn't just their generation, it went on for a while. The revival the Methodism was part of spanned so many decades, I should say. If you look at the impact, we're talking about more than 30 years. Today, that same power is available to us and let me say, I would like to borrow again some words from our preacher this morning, this nurturing of an expectant openness to the Spirit. We need to reclaim this treasure of Wesleyan spirituality, of this openness to the Spirit, so that the words that are coming out of our mouths in the pulpit, around the family table, with our friends, with people on the street, with people on the bus, wherever we may be, on the train, people need to see that we have been with Jesus. This is the fruit of the spirituality that our early fathers in the Wesleyan faith were trying to cultivate. We need that reawakening. Awake, O thou who sleepest, so that our words today will awaken so many who look alive and yet are dead, inside and outside the church. There is, of course, a great challenge today, especially with the young people. I mean, my younger relatives were telling me it's not Generation X, it's now Generation Z or whatever. I mean, I'm lost in that conversation. But sometimes it feels as though the words that we have are not meeting them. The words are not touching their hearts or their minds. It feels as though we are not reaching to the core of this group of people, this generation. And we sometimes simplify it and say it's just about us learning their language and speaking their words. I'd like to say that the power that comes out of being open to the Spirit of God, which was the core of Wesleyan spirituality, is the core of Wesleyan spirituality, is perhaps what we need more than just knowing the language of today and knowing how to use the different modes of communication. We need that more than ever. The challenge, though, to us is this: how do we, in our churches, in our fellowships, in our small groups, at home with our own families, cultivate this habit of, to borrow words from another, of cultivating the presence of God in every aspect of our lives, of using these spiritual disciplines or means of grace, as Wesley might put it. How do we today submit to these things under the guidance of the Spirit, that we may be able to faithfully proclaim the word that the Lord is speaking to this generation and to this time? How are we going to do that? We're going to have to take a leaf from Wesley's life. There is one key aspect, and that I'd like to highlight this moment, is the vulnerability and the humility. When you read Wesley's journals especially, you see this. I mean, it's almost as though you are looking at a different person, because when he was preaching, there was this, you can almost picture, looking at the words that he was speaking, this sort of boldness and this sort of, I mean, he was a little man, but he had power. But when you read the journals, when he's talking about his day to day, you see a vulnerability and a humility before God, a vulnerability and a humility in his openness to the Spirit. And I believe those are key to enabling us to bring back together this key treasure of our Wesleyan tradition, our spirituality, the word, so that the power, the boldness, and unfettered eloquence that we need to be effective proclaimers of the gospel today may begin in our lives. I don't want to go on too long, but I just want us to look at these words from John Wesley. I am not afraid that a people called Methodists should ever cease to exist, either in Europe or America, but I am afraid lest they should only exist as a dead sect, having the form of religion without the power. And this undoubtedly being the case unless they hold fast to both the doctrine, spirit, and discipline with which they first set out. We need this spirit-led, I would call it, not by ourselves, but a spirit-led rediscovery and a holding fast to that with which we first set out, because that with which we first set out was a move of God. And the central part of that was our spirituality. And to sum it up, our spirituality was simply this: to daily commit to being open and vulnerable to God by his indwelling spirit, to be daily formed in his likeness, knowing him, knowing his ways. And being formed in his likeness, all to his glory. If the people called Methodists today are to live up to the calling that God placed on their lives all those years ago, all those centuries, 18th century, we have got to go back and reclaim this family treasure. And again, to repeat the words of Wesley, to become an habitation of the indwelling Spirit of God. As a mission partner, right now we've been mission partners, I think this is our 10th year, probably 11th year, 10th, 11th year. Being out in the field and daily seeking to accomplish the purpose for which God has called us has made us realize that our heritage, this gift that God gave us, this Wesleyan spirituality, is what is of great and vital importance. Because it's almost it's like drinking every day from the living waters. You know, when God speaks to his people and says in Jeremiah, "Oh, you've forgotten about me, and you dug for yourself broken cisterns that cannot hold water." And we have found as mission partners that you will quickly burn out and achieve nothing if you do not drink from the fount of living water. And that's what Wesleyan spirituality is about. And we are grateful for the great tradition of faithful Methodist disciples who went ahead of us, who left this example for us to follow. I'll stop here before I get too excited and preach a whole sermon.
So how do you see this process? You talk about how this Wesleyan spirituality is so enriching to your ministry in the mission context. How do you see, do you have a distinctive view of that awakening process that we might not, be so aware of within our context here of needing to rediscover in our preaching an emphasis on calling people, seeking God to awaken people? Would you like to comment on that?
I think, I would say to my great shame that the first time I came across this thing about awakening, I had assumed that it was only for those who had not yet come to faith. But the more I read, I discovered that it was also a challenge to those of us in the church also, that we needed to stay alert. Mm. And I think particularly for today, our challenge, we've become so burdened with being creative and attracting attention and holding people and attracting people that we forget that we're supposed to be the vessels through which God is calling them to awaken. So instead of awakening them, we entertain them in their sleep. We sort of give them the lullabies that they need. But the Spirit of God is continuously speaking to us. we ourselves need to awaken. We need to awaken first to the fact that our primary call, yes, love the neighbor and proclaim the gospel to them in a way that captures them. But your first call is staying constantly awake and in tune with the Spirit.
That's wonderful.
And that's how we're going to wake people up. I mean, there's no other way, only by the Spirit. If anyone could be a Susanna West, I don't know if we're, I mean, first of all, she had loads. I have 4, and I don't know how I go through the day, but she had more than 3 times what I've got. And we read in the story of the Wesleys that she not only made time for her own walk with the Lord, mainly putting the apron over her head and spending time quietly with the Lord. And everybody in the house knew that when she did that, this was mommy's time. I just go in the kitchen and they know. When I shut the kitchen door, they know this is mommy's time. And the history of the Wesleys tells us that she also had time for each one of them. I think she felt within her that God-given responsibility to invest in her children. And we have to note that she didn't just do with her many children. It was also the servants of the household, relatives of the servants, and neighbors. I mean, there was once a complaint that she was sort of doing what she shouldn't be doing. And she wrote a quite interesting, cheeky response to her husband, which I shall not comment on now. But she didn't do anything that I would say we can't do today. And it really comes out of, at the beginning, personally, I mean, speaking to mothers, being committed to our relationship with the Lord. And from there, I would say, drawing from the refreshment that comes from that and being able to give to our children. And for the young people in our church, they need to see us visibly walking that walk. They need to see that we've been with Jesus. You know, the young people of today, it's not the flashy presentations of sermons. It's not the flashy worship music and the guitars. They need to see that we've been with Jesus. And that Wesley writes about it coming visible in our lives by the fruit of the Spirit, but in our conduct. If the young people in our church, people say, oh, we've only got a few. If the 1 or 2 you've got in your church can see in your life that you've been with Jesus, I tell you, forget smoke machines, guitars, whatever. They are going to be a light for God because they're going to learn from you. So I would say it begins with us. And don't give up. I mean, Susanna Wesley had to do it day after day after day. And as a mother, I can tell you, that wears you out. But the key there, we must remember that Wesley stressed that we can't do this on our own. Our part is the openness, the radical openness and surrender to the Spirit. And being committed to intentionally make the time to be with the Lord. And then He does the rest. Amen.